In Redwood Heights, California, wealth didn't shout. It hummed quietly in the background like a well-tuned engine. Every street looked the same, lined with tall eucalyptus trees, sleek white fences, and driveways that reflected sunlight off polished chrome. It was the kind of place where even silence felt expensive. And somewhere beneath that careful perfection, two brothers who no longer belonged to such a world were trying to find their way back to something that resembled hope. Evan and Ross Caldwell had once believed they were unstoppable. Twin brothers with a small auto repair shop near San Jose, they'd built their business from the ground up, spending long hours beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, hands blackened with oil, laughter echoing over the hiss of air compressors. For years, that garage had been their pride, their proof that you didn't need much to survive if you were willing to work. But time, as it often does, had rewritten their certainty. A series of small misfortunes slowly stacked up. A dishonest supplier, a failed investment, and then the fire. A wildfire that swept through their industrial park and left little more than twisted metal and ash. Insurance barely covered the cleanup. Within a year, the Caldwell brothers had gone from small business owners to odd-job workers, repairing what they could, wherever they could. By the time they found themselves living together again in a cramped rental on the edge of the city, their savings were almost gone. Ross spent his mornings doing delivery shifts, while Evan picked up temporary work at warehouses and moving companies. It was there, among pallets and inventory codes, that he began to notice something strange: the habits of the wealthy. The facility where he worked occasionally stored supplies for luxury home stores, decor pieces, art frames, even customized containers. Among them were high-end modular storage bins called Paragon 300s, transparent, airtight, made for people who wanted their clutter to look beautiful. Evan remembered the price tags, the kind of customers who came to pick them up: architects, collectors, executives. The kind of people who didn't store junk. They stored history. One evening, after another long day of driving, he sat on the front steps beside Ross, the smell of asphalt and engine grease thick in the air. They talked about bills, about the mortgage they'd never get back, about the world that always seemed a step ahead of them. Then, between sighs and silence, Evan mentioned something new, something that had stuck in his head from a conversation at work. One of the warehouse drivers had been bragging about buying a storage unit at an auction. An abandoned one filled with forgotten treasures. Sometimes, the man had said, people die or disappear or just stop paying. You'd be shocked at what they leave behind. That line lingered in Evan's mind long after the conversation ended. He had laughed at first, but the idea grew like a small spark in the back of his mind. People did strange things when they had money. They hid their worth in strange places too. A few nights later, when Ross came home, Evan showed him an online listing he'd found for upcoming auctions. Dozens of units across the Bay Area were set to open for bidding. Most looked ordinary: stacked furniture, old boxes, tools. But one photo stopped him cold. Lot #47B at the Hillside facility in Redwood Heights. The picture showed neat rows of sealed containers, those same Paragon 300s he recognized instantly. They were stacked perfectly, side by side, the kind of order that only someone meticulous and wealthy would maintain. The listing didn't reveal the owner's name, only that the payment had been overdue for 6 months and that all rights to the property had been legally transferred to auction. Evan couldn't shake the feeling that the moment meant something. It wasn't logic, it was instinct. He had learned to trust that quiet voice, the one that appeared in moments that didn't make sense until they did. Ross was more cautious. He had always been the one to check numbers, weigh odds, and remind his brother that good luck was just bad luck wearing a disguise. Yet even he couldn't ignore the flicker of curiosity when he saw the image. Those containers were expensive. They didn't belong in a storage unit forgotten on the edge of town. The auction was held on a cool Saturday morning. The brothers drove to Redwood Heights in their dented pickup, the city slowly giving way to winding roads and manicured hillsides. The facility was clean, orderly, the kind of place that charged extra for silence. Rows of white doors stretched down the asphalt like identical promises. They registered, paid a small fee, and joined a modest crowd. Dealers, collectors, and thrill-seekers chasing fortune in other people's forgotten lives. When the auctioneer began calling lots, the rhythm of the event took over. Doors clattered open one after another, revealing piles of old furniture, broken televisions, clothing, and sometimes nothing at all. Prices jumped and fell like waves. Some bidders left happy, others left muttering under their breath. The brothers stayed quiet, watching, learning. By the time lot #47B appeared, the midday sun had settled high above, washing everything in white light. The door lifted, and there they were, the same containers from the photo, gleaming faintly under a thin layer of dust. A faint scent of cedar drifted out, clean and strange among the smell of metal and asphalt. Inside, the contents were arranged with unsettling precision. Each bin had a label written in steady handwriting. To anyone else it might have looked like ordinary storage, but to Evan the order itself felt expensive. He knew what careless wealth looked like, and this wasn't it. This was deliberate. The auctioneer's voice echoed, calling for an opening bid. A few hands went up. The price climbed steadily, 500, 800, 1200. Evan felt Ross shift beside him. The number on the screen blinked, $1,400, and paused. For a moment, time seemed to hesitate with it. And in that pause, Evan realized he couldn't walk away. Something inside told him that whatever waited behind that door wasn't coincidence. It was opportunity disguised as dust. He raised his hand. The crowd glanced back. The auctioneer nodded sharply, calling the next round. Another bidder pushed the price higher, and for a tense minute, the number rose until it stopped at $1,700. Then silence. The gavel came down, solid and final. The Caldwell brothers had just spent nearly everything they had left. As the crowd moved on to the next unit, the two of them stood in the sunlight, staring at their new purchase. The air felt heavier now, the quiet charged with something unsaid. They didn't speak on the drive home. Words seemed too fragile for the weight of what they'd done. Later that evening, as the first containers were loaded into their garage, the brothers worked in silence under a single flickering bulb. Each bin was heavier than expected. The surfaces were spotless, the lids sealed tight. When Ross brushed off the dust and opened one, he found rows of velvet pouches neatly folded, and beneath them, smaller boxes wrapped in paper that had begun to yellow with time. Another bin held something stranger, thin sheets of leather, old metal tools, and fragments of clock mechanisms arranged like a puzzle half-finished. Evan didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt a shiver run through him. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, the kind that whispers you've just stepped into someone else's secret. Outside, the street was still. The lights from the city glimmered faintly on the horizon, but here, the night felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Evan stood in the doorway of the garage for a long time, watching shadows bend across the floor, and wondered whether they had just stumbled into luck, or into something that would ask for payment later. Morning settled slowly over the Caldwell brothers' small house on the edge of San Jose, painting the walls with a gray, undecided light. The smell of motor oil still clung to the garage from years past, though now the air was different, drier, quieter, heavy with the dust of something old and secret. The first containers from the storage unit sat in an uneven row across the floor, their translucent sides glowing faintly under the fluorescent bulb. Evan stood barefoot, hands on his knees, studying them like a map that promised both treasure and warning. Ross joined him a few minutes later, still half asleep, carrying 2 mugs of coffee that steamed against the chill. Neither spoke for a while. They just looked at what they'd bought, the weight of uncertainty pressing against the silence. When they finally began, it was with the caution of men handling something fragile. The lids came off one by one, and what emerged was not the chaos they'd expected but an unsettling precision. Every item had been arranged by category: small wooden boxes wrapped in linen, velvet pouches tied with thin cord, envelopes marked with dates written in steady ink. One container was filled with watch straps made of leather and gold, another with disassembled mechanisms packed in wax paper. Beneath them lay documents, appraisal certificates, customs forms, and letters typed on yellowed stationery from galleries in London and Zurich. The brothers exchanged glances, understanding without words that this was no ordinary storage. Someone had known exactly what they were preserving. Evan opened one of the boxes carefully. Inside was a pocket watch unlike any he had seen, its face made of porcelain, hands of deep blue steel, and on the back, a small engraving, Radcliffe Collection, 1931. It was heavy, real, almost too perfect. Ross turned the papers over, scanning the letters, his mechanic's mind tracing the pattern behind the details. The name appeared again and again: Martin Radcliffe, antiques dealer, collector, and according to the documents, owner of a private estate in Redwood Heights, the same neighborhood where they had bought the unit. The more they uncovered, the clearer the story became. This wasn't junk, it was inventory. Artifacts of wealth stored with precision, as if waiting for rediscovery. But why had no one claimed it? The documents showed no heirs, no signatures after the late 1990s. It was as though the man had simply vanished and left his legacy behind in a rented steel room. As the afternoon wore on, the brothers' exhaustion began to mix with awe. Every new piece added to the mystery: more watches, intricate silver tools, small ledgers listing numbers and dates. Evan found a thick binder at the bottom of one crate. Its cover was stamped with the crest of Radcliffe Antiques Limited. Inside were photographs, each page a black and white image of an item catalogued with serial numbers and values written in careful script. Many of the pieces matched what now sat in their garage. They had stumbled into a fortune. Or at least into someone else's. Evan leaned against the workbench, rubbing his hands together, his thoughts chasing one another too quickly to catch. The unit had cost them almost everything, but the contents could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Yet beneath the excitement, something in him stayed uneasy. The order was too deliberate, the absence of personal items too complete. Whoever Martin Radcliffe had been, he had treated this collection not as a hobby but as an archive, and archives were meant to be found only by the right people. They took photographs, logged each item, and locked the garage carefully when the light began to fade. For the first time in months, the brothers felt a flicker of hope that didn't immediately collapse under the weight of reality. They went inside, made a modest dinner, and sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of notes. The conversation flowed like it hadn't in years, part speculation, part wonder. Halfway through the evening, Ross's phone buzzed. It was a notification from an online collectors forum where he had quietly posted an image of one of the watches, asking if anyone recognized the maker. There was already a response from a user named Kronos Vault. "Where did you get this? Contact me privately. This isn't something you should have." Ross frowned and showed the message to Evan. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Evan laughed softly, trying to shake off the unease. "Collectors are dramatic," he said. "Maybe it's just rare." But the edge in his voice betrayed his own doubt. They agreed not to respond, not yet. The fewer people who knew, the better. Still, as the night wore on, both found themselves glancing at the garage window as if expecting someone to be there. If you've ever had that moment when curiosity begins to feel like danger, but you just can't stop digging deeper, then this story is for you. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you'd do if you found something priceless in a stranger's forgotten storage. The next morning, they drove back to the facility to clear out the rest of the unit. The manager greeted them with a nod, distracted by paperwork. Everything seemed ordinary until Evan noticed the latch on their unit's door. The new padlock they had placed 2 days earlier had faint scratches around the keyhole, tiny marks almost invisible unless you were looking for them. He ran his thumb over the metal and felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Ross," he murmured, "someone's tried to open this." Ross bent closer. "You sure?" "Positive." Inside, everything appeared untouched. The containers were still stacked neatly, but a small detail caught his eye, a slip of paper half-tucked beneath a box near the entrance. It hadn't been there before. Evan unfolded it slowly. One line, typed neatly, "You bought something that wasn't yours to find." For a moment, the air seemed to thin around them. The hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, the space smaller. Ross looked over his shoulder toward the quiet row of units and the distant outline of the office. No one else was nearby. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed, but for the brothers, everything had. They packed the remaining bins quickly, hearts pounding, and drove home without speaking. Only when the truck was locked in the garage did Ross finally exhale. "So what now?" he asked, voice low. Evan stared through the windshield, the folded note in his hand. "Now," he said after a long pause, "we find out what we really bought." The sun sank behind the horizon as the garage door closed, the brothers framed in the dim amber light of the single bulb, surrounded by the quiet weight of history. The discovery that had begun as a gamble had turned into something more, something alive with a memory long enough to reach out from the past. For the next 2 days, the Caldwell brothers lived in a blur of movement and thought, torn between the practical and the impossible. On the surface, their lives looked unchanged: morning coffee, quiet meals, long silences that filled the space where certainty used to live. Yet beneath that fragile routine, tension had begun to settle like dust. Every sound outside seemed to hold a question. A car idling too long, the faint ring of the doorbell that no one answered, the restless twitch of the motion light by the garage, none of it felt like coincidence anymore. Ross, who had always trusted the facts that could be seen and touched, threw himself into research. He spent hours online cross-referencing the documents from the storage unit, tracing the name Martin Radcliffe through old auction records, estate filings, and newspaper archives. What emerged from that search was a story half finished and half buried. Radcliffe had been one of the most respected antique dealers on the West Coast in the 1970s and 80s, known for his extraordinary collection of timepieces, rare pocket watches, early wristwatches, and precision chronometers worth millions. His name appeared in glossy magazines and gallery catalogs until, suddenly, it didn't. Around 1999, his business had dissolved without explanation. The property in Redwood Heights had been sold quietly to a holding company, and his name vanished from public record soon after. There were rumors, though, scattered mentions on collectors' forums and niche blogs about lost inventory, questionable sales, and private collections moved overseas to avoid taxation. The deeper Ross searched, the more he began to understand that what they'd bought wasn't just a storage unit. It was a fragment of a life deliberately erased. Evan, meanwhile, focused on the physical evidence. He cataloged every watch, every piece of paper, every seal or signature. He noticed that some of the documents bore embossed stamps from European institutions, museums, restoration firms, even a few private galleries. One certificate, dated 1985, identified a specific watch model valued at more than $50,000. Another listed serial numbers that no longer appeared in any modern database. These weren't simple collectibles. They were museum-grade artifacts, but something about the collection felt incomplete. Several catalog entries in the binder were crossed out or missing photographs entirely. Whole pages had been removed, leaving only impressions of staples and faint numbers. It was as if someone had tried to disguise what was missing, or perhaps to hide what was still out there. That evening, the brothers sat at their worn kitchen table surrounded by open folders. Outside, the day had folded into that soft gray-blue hour when the world feels suspended between calm and danger. What if Radcliffe didn't die? Evan said quietly, breaking the silence. What if he just disappeared, on purpose? Ross didn't answer immediately. He had been staring at one of the letters they'd found, a carbon copy of correspondence between Radcliffe and an unknown buyer. The address had been redacted, but the initials at the bottom, HM, appeared several times throughout the paperwork. The tone of the letters was polite but urgent, speaking of pieces too valuable for the open market, and temporary relocation under secure terms. It wasn't the language of hobbyists. It was business conducted in shadows. If he did disappear, Ross finally said, then someone else had a reason to keep this hidden. And now it's in our garage. Neither of them slept much that night. The next morning, Evan decided to take one of the less valuable watches to a small appraisal shop on the outskirts of town. He reasoned that if anyone could tell them what they were dealing with, it would be a professional. Ross protested. It was risky, too visible, but Evan insisted on doing it quietly, using a shop far from Redwood Heights. The place was unremarkable, a small storefront squeezed between a pawn shop and a dry cleaner. The man behind the counter looked in his 60s, with magnifying glasses perched on his forehead and a sharpness in his eyes that suggested decades of experience. He examined the watch under a lamp, said little, and kept turning it in his hands. After a long minute, he set it down carefully and asked where Evan had found it. Evan gave a vague answer. Something about clearing out an estate. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded, though his expression had changed. It's a genuine Radcliffe piece, he said softly. But it's not supposed to exist. Evan frowned. What do you mean? The appraiser lowered his voice. Radcliffe's collection was seized by federal authorities more than 20 years ago during an investigation into art laundering. Only a portion of it was ever recovered. The rest was declared missing. You're holding one of those missing items. The words landed like a slow punch. Evan thanked him, paid in cash, and left quickly, the weight of the watch in his pocket feeling heavier than before. Back home, Ross listened in silence as Evan recounted the conversation. For a long time neither spoke. They were no longer just holding valuable antiques. They were in possession of evidence tied to a crime that hadn't been solved in decades. Still, fear wasn't the only thing that took hold. Beneath it was something quieter, more dangerous: temptation. The watches, if sold discreetly, could erase their debts and rebuild their lives. They could fix everything the world had taken. The thought lingered like a spark neither could extinguish. As the days passed, subtle things began to shift around them. A black SUV appeared more than once parked across the street, engine idling for long stretches before driving off. At night, Ross heard footsteps outside the garage, soft and deliberate, followed by the faint click of something metallic. One morning they found their mailbox hanging open, a single envelope inside with no address, only a short typed message: return what isn't yours. Evan folded the paper, his jaw tight. They're bluffing, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ross looked toward the garage door, the locked space that had become both their salvation and their curse. No, he said quietly. They're remembering. The brothers began moving their findings into safer places, some hidden in the attic, others packed into sealed containers buried in the shed behind the house. They installed a security camera above the driveway and changed the locks twice. but safety felt like an illusion. The night had grown watchful. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of headlights through the curtains carried the same unspoken thought. Someone wanted what they had found back. If you've ever had fortune arrive hand in hand with fear, you'll understand their dilemma. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What would you do if your luck turned out to belong to someone else? As the week unfolded, exhaustion began to show on their faces. The once shared excitement of discovery had turned into a quiet strain neither admitted aloud. On the sixth night, unable to sleep, Ross went out to the garage. He sat on a stool beside the sealed containers, the silence pressing down like a weight. In the faint light of the bulb, the watches seemed to shimmer faintly beneath their glass covers, each one ticking in perfect unison, a rhythm too precise, too alive. It was then he noticed something new. Tucked beneath the binder they had nearly forgotten lay a small envelope sealed with wax. He opened it carefully, revealing a short letter dated April 1999, signed M. Ratcliffe. If this reaches you, it means the collection has survived. Guard it well. There are things inside that were never meant to be sold, nor seen by those who value only price. Time, once broken, can't be bought again. Ross read it twice, then 3 times, the words settling deep into the room's stillness. Whatever Ratcliffe had meant, one truth was clear. They were no longer just holding antiques. They were guarding someone else's unfinished promise. And outside, as if in answer, the black SUV rolled once more down their street and stopped in the same place it always did. Engine quiet, headlights off, waiting. The following morning arrived without promise, its gray sky pressing low over the rooftops of their quiet neighborhood. The air carried that heavy stillness that comes before a storm, thick, metallic, expectant. Evan and Ross sat in silence at their kitchen table, the note from the night before lying between them. Neither had touched it since finding it wedged into their mailbox, yet both kept glancing at it as if expecting the words to change. Return what isn't yours. It wasn't just a threat, it was a statement of ownership. Someone believed the collection still belonged to them, and whoever that someone was, they knew exactly where to look. Ross had spent most of the night replaying every small sound he'd heard outside. The shuffle of gravel, the hum of an idling engine, the slow retreat of tires down the street. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. They weren't being watched by amateurs. Whoever had written that message was patient, controlled, dangerous. He'd seen enough in life to know the difference between curiosity and intent. This was intent. Evan, on the other hand, wasn't ready to surrender what they'd found. He looked at the watches, at the delicate engravings and impossible craftsmanship, and saw not risk but redemption. They'd lost their garage, their independence, their future. And now, for the first time in years, life had handed them something extraordinary. We can't just walk away, he said finally, his voice low but firm. This could change everything. We just need to be smart. Ross leaned back in his chair, eyes shadowed with fatigue. Smart would have been leaving that storage unit alone, he muttered. But deep down, even he knew there was no undoing it now. The moment they'd opened that first container, their lives had split in two, the world before the Ratcliffe collection and everything after. They agreed on one thing: they needed help. Someone outside their circle, someone who understood the world of antiques and could guide them through it without drawing attention. Ross suggested a retired watchmaker he used to know, a quiet man named Leon Becker who had once repaired clocks for museums. If anyone could tell truth from rumor, it would be him. That afternoon they packed 2 watches, the least ornate yet still valuable, and drove to Leon's small workshop in Oakland. The shop looked like a forgotten corner of another century. Brass instruments hung from the walls, and the smell of oil and dust lingered in the air like memory itself. Leon, thin and stooped but sharp-eyed, welcomed them in with a cautious smile. When Ross explained that they had inherited a few old timepieces, Leon didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and took the first watch under his magnifier. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the faint tick of clocks from every corner of the room. Then Leon set down his tools and looked up. "These are Ratcliffe pieces," he said softly, his tone more reverent than surprised. "But not the reproductions. These are from his private line. I didn't think any of them survived." He gestured toward the delicate inscription along the inner rim. "See that marking? It's not decorative. It's a serial unique to his master collection, the ones made for his personal vault. Only a handful were ever documented." Evan felt his pulse quicken. "So they're valuable?" Leon hesitated. "Valuable doesn't begin to cover it. Each of these could fetch tens of thousands at auction, more depending on condition. But," his eyes darkened, "they're also cursed in a way. When Ratcliffe vanished, Rumors spread that parts of his collection had been used to move money and contraband overseas. Authorities tried to trace them, but they disappeared. Some believe those who still hold the pieces aren't collectors, they're cleaners. They make sure nothing surfaces again. Ross exchanged a glance with his brother. Cleaners? Leon nodded slowly. People whose job is to make history quiet. To erase it. If you have these watches, I suggest you keep them hidden. And if anyone comes asking, you've never heard the name Radcliffe. When they left the shop, the daylight already carried the dull orange hue of evening. The brothers drove in silence, each lost in thought. Leon's words echoed in their heads. Make history quiet. It sounded poetic until you realized what it meant. Silence enforced by fear. Back home, the unease deepened. The security camera at the garage showed a single new recording. A dark figure moving past their driveway around 3 a.m., too far for details, too close to be random. They increased the brightness, slowed the playback, but the image remained a silhouette. Someone had been there. Watching. They decided to act before anyone else did. The next morning, Evan called a contact from his warehouse job. A man who occasionally sold restored antiques online under private accounts. He didn't reveal much, only asked how one might safely appraise rare watches without drawing attention. The man paused before answering. Depends on what you've got. But if they're what I think, you're playing with fire. There are circles that still claim ownership over the Radcliffe cash. Some say it was part of a smuggling operation. Others say it was an investment portfolio gone wrong. Either way, people went missing. That night, Ross couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't done claiming what belonged to it. The garage, once their place of invention and safety, now felt like a vault filled with whispers. They began moving the collection in secret. First into weatherproof boxes, then into separate locations. Some they stored in a rented locker across town under a false name. Others they kept closer, hidden in the false floorboards beneath their shed. Every precaution felt both ridiculous and necessary. If you've ever felt the thrill of discovery twist into fear, you'll understand what they were living. Hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments what you think you'd do, protect your find or run from it. A few days later, the inevitable happened. Ross returned home from a short errand to find the front door slightly ajar. Nothing inside was broken, yet something intangible had shifted. A drawer left open. The faint scent of cologne that wasn't theirs. The message was clear. Whoever wanted the collection didn't need to knock. Evan found it first, a new envelope lying on the kitchen counter where their earlier note had once been. This time there was no typewritten message. Only a single Polaroid photograph. It showed their garage interior, time-stamped the night before. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, stood the outline of a man's shadow. For a long moment they just stared. The photo said what words didn't have to: we see you. That night neither of them spoke. They sat in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by documents and unspoken choices. Fear had grown roots inside their lives, spreading quietly but persistently. Yet beneath that fear, another feeling began to stir: defiance. They had spent too long being at the mercy of others. Corporations, fate, luck. This time they would fight for what they had found, no matter what it meant. Ross finally broke the silence. If these people want to make history quiet, he said, his voice steady, then maybe it's time someone made it loud again. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and deliberate. The brothers sat side by side, the Polaroid on the table between them, and waited for the storm to arrive. By dawn the brothers had exchanged fear for a plan, not because courage felt natural, but because procedure leaves less room for panic. They began by turning their scattered safeguards into a proper chain of custody. Every watch photographed beside that day's newspaper and a metric scale. Every movement serial number logged twice. Once in a bound ledger with numbered pages, once on an encrypted drive mirrored to a second device in a safe deposit box 3 towns away. The Polaroid from their kitchen counter, the one that proved a stranger had stood inside their garage, was placed in a plastic sleeve with gloved hands like any other piece of evidence, because that is what it had become. Ross chose their first phone call carefully. A Trustana Estates lawyer whose name he knew from a past customer, a reputation built on quiet wins rather than billboards. In a conference room that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the brothers laid out their story without theatrics. Storage auction, the Radcliffe connection, Leon's authentication, the notes shoved under doors, the break-in disguised as nothing. The attorney did not flinch. He asked for copies, made his own, and then arranged the moving parts into a map. First, notarized the chain, sworn statements, time-stamped photos, and the auction receipt that began it all. Second, notify the storage operator and the local police that any further inquiries, about Unit 17C must route through council. Third, push sunlight toward the right corners of the world, toward institutions that turn rumor into record. The next door they knocked on belonged to the registrar of a regional museum with a small but revered horology collection. She received them in a back office lined with acid-free boxes and stainless tables, the sort of room where facts are made patient. Her questions were clinical, about provenance, serial ranges, tooling marks inside the bridges that only a magnifier could love. When Leon arrived, summoned as an independent expert, his verdict grew bolder in the company of microscopes. Not just Radcliffe watches but Radcliffe's inner circle, the vault line he had built for his own archives. The registrar suggested a tactic the brothers had, in their stubborn independence, nearly missed. Partner with a public institution not to surrender what they had found, but to document it under neutral custody, publish what could be published, and choose a lawful path for whatever could be lawfully sold. It would not eliminate danger, she warned, but it would make intimidation inefficient. Midway through that long day of examinations and signatures, the registrar closed a folder and, with the unshowy warmth of a professional who still believes in outcomes, reminded them that stories like this live or die by community. If you want more true finds handled right, help honest channels grow. If you're the kind of viewer who roots for careful people over loud shortcuts, hit like, tap subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Those small clicks are what keep slow, true craftsmanship visible. The museum's recommendations came bundled with infrastructure. A metallurgist mapped alloys across a sample of cases. A conservation photographer shot macro studies of hand-finished bevels and radial graining. A historian produced a brief on Radcliffe's disappearance and the liquidation that followed, including the rumor mill that had overgrown the facts. The attorney drafted and filed a formal notice of intended consignment for 6 pieces only, representative models with clean serial trails, paired with a public statement that remaining items were under documentation pending additional research. This was not bravado, it was strategy. By making the first step traceable and small, they invited the right kind of scrutiny and starved the wrong kind. The men in expensive shoes responded as expected. A courier delivered a letter on embossed stationery from a recovery firm, claiming to act for shadowy Radcliffe beneficiaries, demanding immediate return of misallocated property. The attorney answered with a stack of case law thicker than the threat, attaching affidavits, photos, and the museum's provisional report. Harassment complaints followed. A detective stopped by the house to collect the Polaroid and a list of plates Ross had jotted at 3 a.m. across 3 anxious nights. Within a week, a pair of citations landed on the broker who had earlier tried to buy their silence. Within 2, the recovery firm lost the appetite to be named in public filings. It is astonishing how quickly bullies learn manners when their audience includes a judge. While the paperwork marched, the brothers moved like craftsmen again. They cataloged the rest of the collection under the museum's temporary custody, hands steady, breaths measured, allowing expertise to replace adrenaline. In the process they discovered what fear had obscured. The watches were not merely assets. They were chapters. Inside a Hunter case they found a dedication scratched so finely it looked like light. For ER, who taught me to listen to ticking as if it were language. In a travel box lay a folded invoice from a Chicago supplier circa 1934, clipped to a small graphite drawing of a dial variant Radcliffe never produced. The registrar filmed their faces as those pieces surfaced, not for marketing but to record the expression that serious objects deserve when they come up for air. Auction day arrived neither as triumph nor spectacle. It arrived like a well-kept appointment, catalog printed, lot numbers assigned, pre-sale condition reports published with an obsessiveness that leaves little room for fantasy. The sale room hummed with the soft static of serious money. Private collectors who dress like teachers, museum representatives who speak with their eyebrows, a few dealers who still carry tape measures as if it were 1978. The first lot, an early Radcliffe chronograph with thin-line numerals and a coulisse lever that looked carved rather than milled, opened higher than any of them had dared to say aloud. Bids moved not like fireworks but like gears, precise, inevitable, each click adding weight. When the gavel fell, the number on the screen belonged to a world that had never once answered to the brothers' anxieties about rent. 4 more watches followed, each enclosing its own quiet astonishment. The totals, after fees and taxes and the museum's modest documentation cost, turned into transfers the attorney parceled forward with the stoic delight of a man who enjoys arithmetic that does not hurt anyone. They did not celebrate loudly. They paid what they owed early, the lingering debt from the shuttered garage, the last of the hospital bills that had taught them to fear mail. They replaced the roof before the rains. They funded a scholarship at the community college where apprentices still learn to file a bridge flat and polish a screw by hand. 1 grant per year for a student who can show that patience is a tool. They donated the travel box with the graphite drawing to the museum on permanent loan under a plaque that named Radcliffe first, the registrar's team second, and themselves last. And they kept a few pieces not for wealth but for witness. A modest 3-hander each, worn not to be noticed but to remember. Most importantly, they bought back time. The old garage reopened, not as a shop that chased every dollar, but as a studio with a workbench reclaimed from storage and a sign that felt less like retail and more like a vow, Twin Balance Company. Repairs, restorations, reason. The first week, neighbors brought kitchen clocks that had lost their mind during a move. The second, a retired teacher arrived with a family watch that had ticked in a pocket through 3 wars and a quiet divorce. The brothers charged fairly, spoke little, and returned the finished pieces with notes that read like weather reports. Beat error corrected. Mainspring replaced. Rate stable at +6s/day. Word spread, not because an algorithm carried it but because satisfied people do. The shadow that had paced their street did not vanish entirely. It simply moved where it belongs, into police reports and court calendars, into the kind of quiet accountability that makes headlines unnecessary. The detective who had first visited their kitchen dropped by 6 months later to return the original Polaroid, case closed. She lingered long enough to listen to a regulator's tick under Ross's loop and smile like a person who had chased uglier sounds all week. When the museum's exhibition opened, time kept honest. The Radcliffe vault line and the people who saved it. The brothers stood by the back wall the way working men do in rooms that prefer to look at objects. A small panel told the story without flattery. 2 mechanics bought an abandoned storage unit and chose documentation over speed, sunlight over secrecy. Visitors slowed in front of the macro photographs, astonished that something smaller than a fingernail could be finished to a mirror without ever seeing a mirror. A kid in a faded hoodie pressed his nose to the glass and whispered that he wanted to learn how to make tiny things right. His mother took a brochure for the community college, muttering that maybe there was a road that did not require leaving. In the months that followed, life did not become a postcard. It became plausible in ways that still startled them. Groceries paid without arithmetic, a truck that started on the first turn, a house that no longer groaned about deferred maintenance. Evenings came with a different kind of silence, not the brittle kind that waits for tires and gravel, but the generous kind that lets a finished day cool. On those nights, Evan wound his wristwatch the way a farmer walks a fence line, slowly, respectfully, aware that care is mostly repetition. They never forgot the lesson the collection had taught them, that custody is heavier than possession, and that value behaves best when someone is willing to say no to the fastest version of yes. They declined offers to consult on storage auctions, ignored requests for paid interviews that wanted melodrama instead of method, and answered the one question that still appeared in their inbox with the same sentence every time. We didn't get lucky, we got careful. The luck was that we learned when careful was enough. On the anniversary of the sale, they closed the shop early and drove out to the storage facility where all of it had begun. The corridor of corrugated doors looked like it always had, sun-faded numbers, a gull arguing with its echo, the smell of dust that attaches itself equally to junk and to heirlooms. They stood for a minute by the blank rectangle where 17C used to matter and understood that the door itself had never been the point. The discipline on the other side had been. Back home, they stuck a new pin into the shop's corkboard map. Another state from which someone had mailed a thank you note for fixing a clock that had stopped during grief and started again during hope. Above the map, a card from the museum's registrar carried the kind of benediction most people don't get in print. When the story could have gone loud and wrong, you kept it quiet and right. That is a rarer craft than any finish under a loop. If you've followed their journey this far, through dust, doubt, and the discipline that turned danger into daylight, tap like so this story travels a little farther, hit subscribe to catch the next true find told with care, and drop a comment with your city. We're adding pins to the corkboard, one steady point at a time. That night, the shop lights clicked off in sequence, the way proper things conclude. The brothers locked the door and walked home under a sky that ticked with crickets. On Evan's wrist, the second's hand advanced with that soft, mechanical confidence that asks for nothing but winding and rewards it with order. On Ross's, the loom pulsed once as his sleeve slid back, a lighthouse in miniature, reminding him that small, honest lights beat larger storms given enough time. They had not beaten history. They had joined the better part of it. And for men who had spent years losing, that felt like the only kind of wealth that keeps good time.